Thank you to the OSCE for allowing me to give the presentation today, and I want to thank our country office for making all the arrangements for me to be here. It's truly a pleasure to be in Kyrgyzstan, and it's great to have the opportunity to speak to you all. The topic, as you can see today, is on critical connections. It's a flagship that the Chief Economist Office in the Europe and Central Asia region has financed and promoted. We have flagships that we produce once a year. This year it was Critical Connections, and also there's another one on social contracts. And the next year we have one on disruptive technology. All of them, as you can see, you can get them online at this link, but the link is also in the overview, and we also have a couple of full reports here. I'm not the only author on this. There's several co-authors that are from within the bank and outside the bank. We've had contributors from the European Institute in Florence, Italy, as well as the European Central Bank. And most of the authors are within the bank. But without further ado, so why did we do this report? Well, Europe and Central Asia is a region that has a rich history of linking parts of the East to the West, and this has generated a lot of different cultural and technology movements. Historically, the Silk Road, of which we are on right now, was historically a very important route for movement of goods, people, and ideas. In the ECA region, regional and global connectivity has been a tremendous convergence machine in terms of incomes, growing from the lower part of the distribution to those in the upper part of the distribution. And that's been primarily due through the change of technology, exchange of technology, and also trade in goods and services. But as you all know, the recent global crisis, the oil price shocks, has led a lot of people in the region to question some of the fundamental aspects of the benefits of connectivity. And so this report tries to understand what those developments are. The questioning has come through in Brexit and different elections in Europe and also throughout the world. People are beginning to question the benefits of connections, benefits of trade, of migration and the like. So it's very important to understand the impact of connectivity. So what's unique about this study? Well, typically connectivity or globalization and its relationship to economic growth has either been understood within a particular type of connectivity. So it's either trade as a share of GDP, or migration as a share of population, or FDI, linking all those types of movements of goods and services and people to economic growth. However, these types of connections are often a complement to each other. So migration can be a complement to trade. In other words, it can work with trade. In fact, that was my dissertation. I did my dissertation in Los Angeles, and I was amazed about the different immigrant communities within Los Angeles influencing the trade with their home country. So oftentimes these connections complement each other. Immigration complements trade. Immigration can complement FDI. In Georgia, for example, a lot of the Turkish migrants are some of those that are investing most in particular parts of the industry, like the hotel industry. A lot of the Turks are building hotels and building the tourism community that brings visitors over and complements trade and the like. So ideas are often translated or transmitted through these different types of complementary connections. So trade can be enhanced by migration, and the type of information that's needed for trade can be transmitted through immigrants. So an immigrant might know, wow, there's an opportunity here in, let's say I'm an American migrant to Kyrgyzstan. I might see opportunities for different businesses based upon my experience at home. Also, I might know people that I trust, because contracts aren't completely complete, that I trust to engage in this commercial activity. So that can be a transmission for ideas and knowledge and for goods. Some of it being explicit, written in books or blueprints, and some of it being tacit knowledge. Particularly this tacit knowledge is the more difficult to capture and more difficult to transmit, and you need to have goods moving or people moving, starting new businesses, to create the avenues for this tacit knowledge. That tacit knowledge not being something you can write in a book or write in a blueprint, but is only something you can do or learn by doing, or learn by example from seeing other people do it. So whom you're connected to might be just as important as the type of connection. So for example, we've typically measured trade as overall trade to GDP, but it may matter if you have $1 of trade with Germany might matter more than $1 of trade with Algeria, because technology is more plentiful in Germany, and maybe Germany is more connected to other countries in the world. So you can indirectly get access to third countries by connecting to Germany. So it's kind of like social networks between people. So if you're in a group of people, knowing somebody that's well connected to others, by knowing that person, you might be able to get to know other people. Just as in a social network, you can think about countries in that same type of network. So being connected to well-connected countries might be an avenue for transmission of ideas and technology. Finally, being connected in a multidimensional world implies that shocks in one dimension, such as trade, might have shocks in other dimensions. If you have a cut in trade, you're likely to experience a cut in migration, and vice versa, or a cut in foreign direct investment, you can have a cut in trade as well. So countries that try to, or believe that they're only cutting immigration, for example, in the current situation, particularly in Europe with migration, you can imagine that cutting migration flows might have adverse effects on trade flows as well. So what are some of the key findings? Well, ECA's various forms of connectivity facilitates the transfers of technology and ideas that are complements to each other, and that is critical to growth and shared prosperity. These connections complement each other, as I mentioned before. The depth of overall connections and the geographical composition of these connections matter and emerge from firm linkages in global value chains, as well as foreign ownership and management that generate local spillovers. Deep integration of countries into the EU has generated important benefits to growth through knowledge transfers. Central Asia, Russia, and Turkey have benefited from regional connections as well, but the depth of these connections are less pronounced. Increased connectivity can expose Europe and Central Asia countries to external shocks, particularly those from countries at the center of the global connectivity network. The remedy to prevent the transmission of shocks is not isolation, which sacrifices growth, but rather broadening the range of connections to reduce the impact of any single shock from a particular country to mitigate shocks. So what is the outline of the presentation? Well, first area is, what does ECA's connectivity look like? We'll take a look at some network diagrams to show what that is. How do the connections transfer knowledge? We'll take a look at the specific examples of FDI and foreign direct investment. What is the infrastructure and in terms of facilitating connections? So we have the flows of knowledge, which are transmitted through migration, through trade and FDI, and then we have the infrastructure, which facilitates these flows. Those are like the water and the pipes that carry them. So the pipes are the infrastructure that complement some of these other types of connections. Then I'll look at multidimensional connectivity explicitly and show that it's related to economic growth. Then I'll take a look at the shocks using this model of multidimensional connectivity and how those shocks are transmitted to other countries. And finally, what are the policy implications? So what does economic connectivity look like currently? So let me explain a little bit these diagrams. They look a little bit confusing at first. Each node here, or a country, the size of that bubble represents total trade to GDP. So the larger is that node, the larger is trade to GDP. And there's two outgoing arrows. Those arrows show the two largest export partners in the global, for each country. Now the larger nodes tend to be pushed towards the outside of the circle. This is all for displaying purposes, so you can see whose connections are the most strongest. And then the smaller nodes tend to be drawn to the larger nodes, so there's attraction effects. It's kind of like a solar system, right? You see countries that are, or planets that are circling around the sun, which is the largest. There's a gravitational force that pulls other planets toward the sun, that's gravity, but also you have the spinning motion that pushes the larger planets away. That's centrifugal force, right? So the centrifugal force acts largely on the larger nodes, which pushes them away, and the smaller countries tend to group towards those that are most related to them through the force of flows. Does everybody understand that? Any question? Okay. So the countries in Europe and Central Asia are colored blue, and the rest of the world is colored orange. Darker orange means that they're stronger in terms of their size of size of trade to GDP. The lighter orange is the size of trade to GDP is a little bit lighter. Same thing for the blue. As you can see here in 2000, around Germany, there's a lot of countries that are circling Germany. And in 2014, the countries in Europe and Central Asia are a little bit tighter. They're not as spread out. You can see they're a bit more pushed in toward the northern end. And then one of the startling things is you can see China, which is relatively small in 2000, grows to be quite large. And it gets pulled to the center because even though it's a large country, a large trading partner in the global network of countries, it's being pulled both towards Europe and both towards the US and Japan here. It's another large partner. Now you can see I circled the countries of Central Asia. Here's Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. And you can see that the Central Asian economies tend to be pulled more towards Germany, and Russia's up there as well. But Kazakhstan is also pulled a little bit toward the United States, and that's because of the oil, large oil exports to the US. And then you can see here that in 2014, the movement of trade has shifted a little bit, and most of it is pulled up towards between China and Europe, with Germany as the hub. So now let's take a look at FDI. As you can see, FDI's ECAs, or Europe and Central Asia's inward FDI, has grown, but inflows have increased from the outside of the region. So what you see here in 2000 is mainly the largest countries being both the sources and recipients of foreign direct investment. US, GBR is Great Britain, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, France, as being particularly large senders and receivers of FDI. Another interesting point here in 2012 is that a lot of the FDI tends to be not only just in the large developed countries, but it's spread throughout the world. Spain, and you can see that is Germany. Belgium becomes a large one. France becomes quite large. Switzerland. You also have China here. China is relatively small in 2002. It becomes larger, and it's related to trade with Hong Kong, or FDI with Hong Kong. So the size of the node is related to total FDI, and there's two outgoing arrows representing the two largest investing countries that it sends FDI to. For the United States, you can see a large amount goes to the Netherlands and then to the UK. France goes to the United States and Belgium. Japan to the Netherlands and the US. This is in 2012. In earlier years, it was Canada and the UK where the US was investing a lot. Germany was investing in the UK, and a bit in, I think that's Italy, not too sure. Yeah, I think that's Italy. Okay. And then you can see where the Central Asian economies are located. You can see that a lot of the Central Asian economies are closely related to FDI from Germany, and except for Turkmenistan, which is pulled towards China. And here you've got a lot of the economies here in the north, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan being pulled towards Turkey and some of the other countries in Europe. It's in the European sphere here. And also Kazakhstan being pulled towards the US, and China, and Turkmenistan, Britain, and the United States. So now we're talking about migration. And here you can see Russia in the early 2000s was sending a lot of migrants to Germany. That's right here. And a lot of migrants moving between Russia and Ukraine. And a lot of the Central Asian economies sending migrants to Russia, but also to Germany in the earlier part of the 2000s. In the later part of the 2000s, you can see not as many immigrants going to Germany, but still remaining a lot of migrants going to and from Central Asia to Russia and Ukraine. So you can see the grouping of migration. So now that we've seen the general picture of these three large channels for connectivity, let's take a look at the relationship between FDI and foreign management on how ideas get transferred. So we're going to, first I gave you a general picture of what the world looks like in terms of trade in these three important layers. Now we're going to take a look at how information actually gets transferred. So this is the process of knowledge transfers through firms. We use firm-level data. We look at how firms invest in foreign countries and how the transfer of knowledge gets from the center of the global economy in terms of ideas and new technology to more developing countries. So typically the global value chain frontier, global value chains are, as you know, firms investing in other countries in different parts of the production process. So a lot of the new technology gets done in the global lead firms we use data from Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And so a lot of the technology gets developed in the lead firms outside of the developing or emerging countries. They invest in the national firms of the developing countries. So the lead firms, let's say in Germany, invest in the lead firms in Poland or in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. That gets translated to the non-frontier in of the national firms in the developing countries, and then that gets some of that gets outsourced to smaller firms within the countries. So if Germany invests in Kyrgyzstan, the investment takes place first in the bigger firms in Kyrgyzstan, and that gets transferred into the smaller firms as the bigger firms outsource some of their processes to smaller firms, such as maybe some of the transport gets done by smaller firms within the receiving country. And then that gets transferred to the remaining firms, some of the technology and ideas, predominantly through domestic networks, some of our direct access to the multinationals. So it's a whole process. You have the large firms in mostly advanced countries, dealing with the large firms in the emerging countries, and then that gets transferred to the smaller firms through this whole process of knowledge transfers and processes. So you can see that the process and participation into these global value chains through countries is very related to growth in the value added of exports. So here you can see the relationship of growth and participation in global supply chains. Hungary having a negative growth is related to smaller growth of exports of value added. Those countries with large participation in global value chains, such as Turkey, also have relatively large growth in export value added. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, but it's a very strong relationship between participation in value chains and the growth of value added in supply chains. And why is that? It's because these firms in the country tend to receive knowledge, and we know that knowledge, as different literature has shown, is highly related to long-term economic growth. So the more knowledge you accumulate, the larger is the growth in the long run. So now we looked at value chains, the relationship between firms. Now we're looking at ownership. So does foreign ownership or foreign management confer any benefits to a local economy? So we use firm-level data for Europe and Central Asia economies. There's a wide variation of ownership and management across countries. UK and Ireland have about 30% foreign-owned or foreign-managed firms. Hungary has almost zero. Through foreign connections, we see that there's benefits to firms, allowing them to have higher growth in revenues, jobs, and average wages. Foreign ownership is linked to better management practices that can be transmitted from the host to home countries. In the overview, you can see that there's a strong relationship between those countries that receive foreign ownership or foreign management and the management practices of those source countries. So I think that's on page... It's on page 20 here of the overview. Anyway, there's also spillover effects to firms that aren't foreign-owned or aren't foreign-managed. So you can see that there's 3 bars here. The first bar represents locally owned foreign-managed firms. The second bar, or the green bar, is foreign-owned but locally managed. And the last bar, the green bar, the blue bar, and I guess the turquoise bar, whatever you want to call that, is foreign-owned and foreign-managed. So you've got locally owned, foreign-managed, foreign-owned, locally managed, and foreign-owned and foreign-managed. And this is all the growth of operating revenues relative to locally owned, locally managed. And you can see that the growth of operating revenues is highest. It's high for either locally owned or foreign managed. It's about 15% higher for those firms compared to locally owned, locally managed. And the foreign owned but locally managed is about 25% higher than locally owned, locally managed. And those firms that are foreign owned and foreign managed have close to 30% higher growth in operating revenues. You can see there's also higher job growth in these firms compared to locally owned, locally managed, and there's also higher average growth in wages. And that's because of what we believe to be better management practices and also the transfer of knowledge that you get by foreign management or foreign ownership. They bring ideas and technology to the local markets. Now, we ask the question, is it only in those firms that are foreign owned or foreign managed, or both, that are receiving these bumps in productivity? Well, it's not only those firms that are directly foreign owned, foreign managed, but also locally owned and locally managed firms also experience higher growth in revenues, employees, and wages if they're in a region, that's the first panel, or a sector that has a lot of foreign-owned or foreign-managed firms in it. So these are not foreign-owned or foreign-managed firms, but they're just in a region or in a sector with foreign-owned and foreign-managed. These lines represent the average effect. So these lines right here is the average effect, and that's all positive. And then you can see it broken down into locally owned, locally managed, mature and large firm, or small and young firms. Small and young firms actually do worse than the mature and larger firms. But what you can see is that the average effect is still larger. Here is that the larger more mature firms are able to absorb technology better than the smaller and young firms. So what happens is that the smaller and young firms shed labor to the more mature and larger firms as the foreign-owned firms come to the region. They can absorb the technology and therefore they grow, take employment away from the smaller and young firms. That seems to be a case also with the sectoral spillover effects. So regardless of which region you're in, if you're in a particular sector, such as agriculture or manufacturing, if you're larger and more mature, you're able to absorb this technology, whereas the smaller firms can't compete and they tend to drop out or shrink. So here's transport. What are some of the challenges in transport across the region? First, in terms of passengers, we take a look at the cost and the time to travel within a country, and we divide the countries into different regions. The top is the Western Balkans. Then we have, it's kind of hard to see here. I think that's, gosh, I can't even read it. Anyway, let me just circle, what is it? South Caucasus? Oh, South Caucasus, Western Balkans. And then we've got Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Advanced Europe, Turkey, and Russia. And you can see at the top here, the cost and time from traveling within a country is relatively low for Central Asia, but you can see the time is relatively high. So the time to get within a country from one city to the next is relatively high for Central Asia. It's most expensive for Russia here. You can see Russia has a lot of challenges. If you take a look at passenger traffic between countries in Central Asia, it's pretty expensive. And also the time is actually the most timely to get from one of the countries in Central Asia to another country within Europe and Central Asia, so that the whole region. So crossing borders is a big challenge for Central Asia countries. Now, when we talk about freight, freight is relatively costly within Central Asia. Time, though, doesn't differ that much. It's on the low end, except for Russia. Russia is a very expensive country because of the size. I mean, geographically, it's a very large country, and it takes a lot of time to get between one city and the other within Russia for freight. And the cost to go between countries for freight, Central Asia is one of the three most expensive countries, along with Turkey and Russia. And it's the second most costly in terms of time to get between countries. It's interesting, time-wise for freight domestically is on the low end, but once you cross the border, it becomes very expensive. And that can be due to logistical costs at the border transaction, wait times, and things like that. This is a network measure of criticality, in other words, the importance of each country for cost, if you try to avoid that. So we have Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, Germany, and Poland being very critical in the network of transport in Europe and Central Asia. And you can see that here's Central Asia really depending a lot on Russia for its access to the rest of Europe, and Central Europe particularly, through Russia. So to avoid Russia, it's very costly in this network. That's why Russia is very important. For Germany, you can see France depends a lot on Germany, and a lot of the other countries like Spain, Portugal, what is this? Ireland and Georgia? Well, Great Britain, GBR, okay. Great Britain depend upon France to get the rest of Europe, and you got Hungary being very important to the Caucasus and Central Europe, being very important in that regard. So now we've got the different layers. Showed you the flows and the pipes. Now we're going to talk a bit about the relationship between all these layers and economic growth. So you can think of each layer as its own network of countries, and you can develop measures of centrality for each one of these layers of network. What do I mean by centrality? So in network analysis, we measure importance of a country by how connected it is and how connected its connections are. So it's kind of like Google's PageRank algorithm, and we use Google's PageRank algorithm to measure this idea of centrality. So a website, for example, is very central if that website has a lot of other websites that are connected to that website, and if those websites that are pointing to that website are also have a lot of websites that are pointing to it, okay? So the larger number of websites that are connected either directly or indirectly to that website creates a higher Google PageRank rating. That's a measure of centrality, how central that page is, that web page is. Well, you can think of countries in the same way, okay? So each layer of a network has its own centrality, and each country has a measure of centrality. So you can imagine Germany being particularly central because a lot of countries point to that country in terms of the trade network. Also, you can imagine China and the trade layer being very important. Then you have the FDI layer, and then you have, I call it N network, or the other layers that we add. We include migration, we include portfolio financial flows as another layer. We include airline connectivity, and I think that's it. We have 6 layers. So FDI, trade, migration, portfolio, airline connectivity, and ICT, Internet Communications and Technology. So 6 layers. And if you can imagine, if you shine a light through all these different layers, then you come up with what's the shadow, and that's the multidimensional connectivity network. And we can develop measures of centrality given all these different layers. We measure each layer separately and weight it by its impact on economic growth. So that's how we come up with this multidimensional connectivity network, or the collapsed network as we discuss it. So here's the measure of growth. If anybody studied these growth models, growth is a function of an intercept plus all these covariates, which determine economic growth. In our model, we have measures of initial GDP per capita, governance, education, government size, and inflation. We also have a measure of investment, which is not listed, but it's there. And then we have this measure of network centrality, which can be the measure of centrality for each layer, which we then compare to the multidimensional connectivity centrality measure. And we show, as we'll show in the next graph, the multidimensional connectivity layer does better than any single layer by itself. And that's the idea that we're trying to get at, that it's the importance of measuring all the layers, and the complementarity of the layers is most related to economic growth. So here's this is the individual layers and its relationship to growth. As you can see, trade and FDI are relatively high. Migration is the third most important, and then airline connectivity. Interestingly enough, ICT, or Internet Communications Technology, is not statistically significant, and neither is portfolio flows. ICT technology, we think it may be not important, not because it's not important in reality, but because of the error in our measurement of that variable. All we have is bilateral telephone communications, and we have overall network connectivity to the world. We divide the overall network internet connectivity to the world, and we parse it out by country by its telephone communication. So our assumption is that if somebody's calling a lot from, let's say, Kyrgyzstan to Russia, then we assume that network traffic on the internet is also a lot via Russia, okay? So we don't have a direct measure of internet communications between Russia and Kyrgyzstan, for example. We do have a measure of telephone calls. We also have a measure of telephone calls between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, let's say. And we assume that those internet communications via are matched to the telephone communications. But that may be an incorrect assumption. But there's really not a measure of direct internet communications between countries. We have a measure of portfolio flows, which we think is good. But oftentimes portfolio flows are determined by the tax advantages and tax havens. So there's a lot of flows going to Luxembourg, Cyprus, and other countries that aren't related to economic activity, but related to kind of tax havens, shielding your income from the tax authorities in your home country. So that may be related to a lot of volatility here. So that may be why it's not significant. Yeah.
These are related to these Central Asian countries or the European countries, or this is the average of...
This is the global economy. It includes Asia, Latin America, Europe, Central Asia, Russia, Africa, every country in the world. We have about 100 countries that we include into this analysis. So this is the multidimensional connectivity index, and you can see it's pretty close to 7. So that's 7 percentage points of extra growth per year, 0.7, almost a full percentage point of growth. If you have one standard deviation higher than the global average of multidimensional connectivity. The largest here is trade, which is about 0.61%, so it's closer to 6, and this is close to 7. So you get a little bump by looking at all forms of connectivity in the multidimensional connectivity index. Yep.
Like here in ICE and portfolio flows, so their significance level is less than 1?
Significance level is less than the 10% level. So that's these.
There are no stars there.
Right, there are no stars. So these are statistical significance levels. So we only mark it as being significant if it's greater than the 10% significance level. So at least 90% confidence that that coefficient is different than 0. So we have more than 1% or 99% confidence that this level of this variable is different than 0. That's just a econometric analysis. And also 99% confidence that this coefficient, which is about 0.6, is different than 0. We have about a 90% confidence interval that migration is significant, 90% confidence level that airline connectivity is different than 0, but we can't rule out the fact that ICT and portfolio flows have a 0 effect on growth. So it's basically 14 years of data that we have a complete data set, and that's behind these coefficients. In the analysis that we'll show on shocks coming up, we'll take the latest data point and put it into this model. And some of the latest data points include 2016, 2015. Others, like migration, only go up to 2010. Because the migration data, although we forecast it using some interpolation methods to 2014, so it's complete with the other data. Yeah.
Because in the previous, we personally faced such kind of problems that in a certain period of time we take some data, but we just forgot to include some shocks. Let's say immigration from 2002 to 2014. There is a huge period of time, and we have a lot of these fluctuations in the world. If you see the world, there are like US is involved in different areas in wars, like in Afghanistan and some other countries, in Iraq, yes, even financial crisis. So do we have these kind of, considering all these shocks in this model, or do you consider it? Or?
Yeah, so we are looking at longer term growth. We're not looking at cyclical or shocks to determine these coefficients. And that's what we want to do. We need a long time period. We have annual data, but we want a longer time period so that the effect of shocks is not influencing the data that much. We want to get the longer run trend, okay? In the hypothetical shock analysis that we'll use, we'll ask the question, what happens if there's a shock in Germany? What happens if there's a shock in Russia? And see how that affects the connections between other countries. So we'll get to that, okay? But you're right, there are shocks, but we specifically didn't want to model in the empirical analysis the long term. What we're trying to get at is, you know, the basic trend, not necessarily the shocks. So we can rank each countries by their multidimensional connectivity index. And you can see that Western Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, and Central Europe have relatively high levels of connectivity. Russia, Turkey, and Eastern Europe have medium levels of connectivity on these multidimensional connectivity index when you add up all these subcomponents. And then you get Western Balkans, Central Asia, and the South Caucasus with relatively low connectivity. This is the multidimensional connectivity index. And then these are the sub-indices here that are rated. And then you can see shock. So this is taking the multidimensional connectivity model and saying, okay, what happens if there's a shock in Germany here? Which countries are affected the most? And what's interesting about it is that those countries that are affected the most get their global connectivity directly from Germany, which is the country it's most dependent upon for its global connectivity. So Ukraine, for example, is the most affected. This is the initial level of connectivity, and this is the change in connectivity. So this initial level of connectivity won't change between the graphs. It's only the level of the change in the initial level of connectivity that you're really interested about. Those here on the right are the most connected in the world. Those here on the left are the least connected. Afghanistan is the least connected in the world on the left. Those that are the most connected are US, China, the Netherlands, Singapore, Canada, Italy, France. And you can see that those connected those that are most connected to Germany or rely on Germany for its global connectivity through direct connections to Germany, but also indirect connections to other countries, are Turkey, Poland, Ukraine, Croatia, Malta, Bangladesh, Syria, Macedonia, Sri Lanka, Czech Republic. Now we can see how Central Asian economies are likely to be affected. And so you can see a shock in Germany is going to be about a half a percentage point decrease in connectivity through a 10% shock in Germany. That's all levels of connectivity being hit by 10%. Tajikistan, a little bit over 1%. Kazakhstan, about 2.5%. Moving on to the United States, you can see that those countries that are most directly connected to the United States, Guatemala, Salvador, Trinidad, Tobago, Ecuador, Jamaica, Belize, Mexico, are going to be highly affected by a global shock originated in the United States. And then you can see what the effect is on Central Asia. You got Kyrgyzstan, about 1%, Tajikistan, about 2%, Kazakhstan, a little bit less than that, about 2% as well. And you can see that those countries that are relatively well connected globally tend to be less affected by country shock in the United States because they have a lot of different ways to access the global economy, not just through the United States. Here's a shock in Russia, and you can see that Central Asia is quite a bit affected by a shock in Russia. But here, it's interesting to note, because Russia isn't well connected to the global economy, a shock in Russia affects Kyrgyzstan, but it's less than 1 percentage point. It's just 0.07 maybe. Tajikistan 0.12, not even a full percentage point, less than 1/10 of a percentage point. And Kazakhstan also less than 1/10 of a percentage point here. So Russia is very important, but in terms of, you know, shocks in these other more connected countries, it translates less to an impact of connectivity. Do you have a question?
This initial level of connectivity, does it show the initial level of connectivity of this country with the Russian Federation or with the world?
This is with the world.
With the world.
This is its overall connectivity with the world. That has not changed in any of those graphs. This initial level of global connectivity doesn't change, and this is the effect of its global effect on connectivity. Okay?
And what year is it?
This is the latest year available, so that's probably 2014.
2014.
Right.
Because like, can you go back? Afghanistan somehow like they were like the military.
So here's Afghanistan. It's still the least connected in the world, but it's the most affected by a shock compared to other countries. But if you take a look at, so it's a negative 0.12. Let's go back. Afghanistan is about a negative 2 with a shock in the United States. Okay? So Afghanistan is affected the most of any other country that would be affected by a shock from Russia, but it's less than a shock from US. So transmission of shock depends upon which type of link is affected. So here we take a look at those countries that are affected by a shock originating by a trade shock, FDI shock, or a migration shock. In Central Asia, you can see that Central Asia is most affected by a shock in China and Russia, and an FDI shock in Russia and China as well, and a migration shock in either Russia or Germany. And there's only one country that affects another region, and that's the South Caucasus, affected by a shock in Russia or Kazakhstan. Those are the two largest. It's mostly Russia, but also Kazakhstan is the second most important for the South Caucasus via a shock in FDI. So what's the progress on policies? You can see that on lowering trade barriers, particularly this is FDI restrictiveness, there was a large decline for most of Europe and Central Asia up to about the global crisis in 2008. And then 2008, the restrictiveness on FDI has kind of flattened out. There hasn't been much progress on reducing barriers to FDI in Western Europe, Southern Europe, Central Europe, or Northern Europe. In terms of Central Asia, which is the blue line here, or the Russia Federation, which has more restrictiveness on FDI than Central Asia does, or the other Eastern Europe, or even Turkey here. Turkey has less restrictiveness compared to these other three countries. It's also flattened out since the global crisis. Not too much progress has been made, but out of the 4 countries in the low connectivity area here, Central Asia did see some progress in 2012. And in terms of tariff rates, Central Asia, they actually increased. So although trade FDI restrictiveness fell in Central Asia, you can see in the 2006-2015 area, tariff rates did go up a little bit compared to other subregions in Europe and Central Asia. And these are restrictiveness on telecom and transport. We only have the last year available here, 2015 for Central Asia. You can see that telecommunications restrictiveness is relatively high. Also transport restrictiveness is relatively high, although transport restrictiveness is not as bad as it is in Turkey and also other Eastern European countries. And these are the number of enforced bilateral investment treaties. They grew for Central Asia between 1980 and 1999 to 2000 and 2016. There's been an increased number of bilateral investment treaties, which is a good thing. And here you have sanitary and phytosanitary barriers and technical barriers, which did increase a bit, but they're not as restrictive as they are, for example, in the European Union, which has relatively high barriers. Technical trade barriers, like standards on, the cars, or restrictions on plant food or other types of food products. People can think about these as good things, or they can think about them as bad things. Sometimes they're just measures of protection and restrictions on transport of goods and food. Other times, they might be there for health reasons, but regardless of what it is, they do restrict trade, and oftentimes they're not as benign or not as good as you would think they are. So that's why we call them barriers.
So,
Yes?
on the FDI restrictiveness index, there was like few slides before.
Uh-huh.
The total FDI index of the Central Asia is, the calculation starts from 2010. Is it because the data was missing?
Right, the data is not there before.
The data is not
Yeah.
there. All right.
So this is infrastructure indicators. And you can see here that Central Asia ranks the lowest on indicators of strength of infrastructure. That includes roads, airports, other infrastructure indicators. And here's Kyrgyz Republic. You can see it's below the Central Asia average. So key messages to conclude. Being well connected in the global network of countries is important for long-run inclusive growth. Because of complementarities in the type of connections, a balanced connectivity profile is more important than being well connected in a single dimension. Deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, migration policy, and transport are a good way of achieving this broad-based connectivity. Increased connectivity can expose ECA countries to external shocks, but particularly those emanating from countries that are well connected in the global network of countries. The remedy is not to be isolating yourself from this connectivity, but rather, which sacrifices growth, but rather balanced connectivity across a range of connections to different countries to reduce those risks and cope with shocks. Thank you. And I'd be open up